Well, quite frankly, if you are a beer drinker, you're not going to be delighted. I find it a little bit concerning that they're taxing the staple food of many of my students in that respect. But the tax brackets have been shifted a little bit to allow for some measure of relief. So in the short term, your ordinary citizen is not necessarily going to have any reason to feel terribly excited about this budget. But from a macro perspective, this is an unbelievable document. And I think it's worth mentioning that I don't think Finance Minister Godongwana can believe his luck, because it is highly unlikely that a taxation revenue overrun of the magnitude of 182 billion rand will ever be repeated again. So it has been a relatively easy task, and although we did a very good job, we must actually thank the South African mining sector, because they have made record profits. And as a result, government has received record dividend tax from these mining companies, and that has allowed him, that has given him so much leeway to prepare a budget that is geared for future growth.
Then the levies on fuel has not been raised the first time in 32 years. That should be a positive thing for the normal South African.
Yes, I must tell the viewers that if you were to go and look at the budget review, especially, and also start picking the nuts, look at the nuts and bolts of the budget speech, it is just unbelievable how many positive aspects we find. Firstly, and I think this is the most important point, lowering the company tax rate. That takes guts for an organization like the ANC, and I can guarantee you there are people in the ANC that don't like this. But President Ramaphosa and his inner circle, they realize, but this is good for the economy. This enhances South Africa's competitiveness. And this can play a major role in also creating employment. The stabilization of the government debt GDP ratio is just brilliant. There are other emerging markets like Argentina that are still battling. They have a public debt GDP ratio in excess of 100%. Ours has now stabilized at between 70 and 75%, with a very good chance that that will start declining again. And a primary budget surplus within the next 2 years is highly likely. Now, if you had suggested that 18 months ago, they would have sent you to one of these establishments like Valkenburg in the Western Cape, Weskoppies in Pretoria, for the very, very, very nervous. And this is a reality. So it is really a magnificent budget in one word.
And then just staying with the fuel issue, it's positive news that he and Minister Gwedi Mantashe is talking about ways to regulate the fuel price in a different manner.
Yes, Izak, my apologies. I inadvertently dodged the fuel levy issue, which is really good. And what you also find in this budget, it ties into some extent to Zondo, but it ties in very clearly to this amazing deal. I don't think the average South African appreciates the importance of the deal that we struck at COP26 with the US and the major economies of Western Europe. We're talking here about 130 billion rand that will flow into South Africa in the next 3 years to help us transition from fossil fuels to renewables. And you could clearly also see this in the budget, and I can see that what you're alluding to, because Mr. Mantashe and Mr. Ramaphosa are not on the same page when it comes to the energy policy that we need in the future. And I would be very surprised if Mr. Mantashe doesn't find himself, maybe in an ambassador post somewhere, hopefully, a very distant part of the world within the next year or two, because he clearly hasn't got the message. We must save this planet. And South Africa is the most pivotal economy on this continent, and we have an immense role to play. And it is irresponsible to continue talking about coal. Yes, of course we're going to need coal for a long time, but we must start talking about solar and wind, and we've got lots of that stuff in this country.